been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that. And it's
No one expected it, not from him. Prince Edward, the quiet, composed royal who rarely spoke beyond duty, looked straight into the camera and said words that froze the nation. "There's something I've carried for too long," he began, his voice low, almost breaking. What followed was not gossip or scandal, it was truth, heavy and heartbreaking. For a man who had lived his life in the shadow of others, his confession tore down the walls of silence. Every word struck deep. When it ended, Britain did not just listen, they wept. And suddenly the calmest royal had become the most human of them all. The quiet royal's breaking heart. For years he had been the family's quiet strength, the one who stood behind rather than before, who smiled when others argued, and who worked without applause. To many, Edward was the forgotten prince, the man who seemed content in the background. But inside him, a storm had begun to form, soft at first, like a whisper at the edge of his heart, and then louder, more painful, more impossible to ignore. He had spent his life being the dutiful son, the one who never caused his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, a single night of worry. While his brothers and sister each had their share of public scandals and private storms, Edward walked a path of quiet service. He fulfilled engagements with steady grace, supported his wife Sophie through every challenge, and protected his children's privacy fiercely. But in the silence of his room, when the palace lights dimmed, Edward would find himself thinking about her, his mother, and the weight she had carried until her last breath. The late queen had ruled through storms and sun, never faltering, never breaking. To her, duty came before everything else, before love, before rest, before family peace. And Edward, her youngest, had admired her for it, even when he saw what it cost her. He had promised himself he would live her way, with composure, restraint, and loyalty. Yet lately that promise has begun to hurt. The royal family was no longer whole. The warmth that once filled family gatherings had thinned into something cold and uneasy. The brothers, King Charles and Prince Andrew, Prince William and Prince Harry, rarely stood together without tension lurking in their eyes. Words that should have brought comfort now carried judgment. Smiles seemed rehearsed. Even laughter, when it came, sounded distant. The palace had become a house of echoes. Behind closed doors, whispers moved like wind through narrow halls. "There's worry about the king's health," one voice would murmur. "William's burden grows heavier," another would sigh. "Harry won't return." "Not really," a third would say quietly, as if afraid the walls themselves might carry the gossip further. Edward listened, but he did not join in. He simply walked past, holding his quiet dignity like a fragile glass that might break if he ever dared speak the truth. For years, he had believed that silence was a kind of strength, that calmness was his way of serving the crown. He had watched his siblings clash and falter, and told himself he was different. He had built a life on peace, even when that peace came from swallowing pain. But lately, the peace was cracking. When he looked at his brother Charles, now the king, Edward could see exhaustion behind his smile. When he saw William, he saw the same heavy shadow that had once haunted their father, the weight of a destiny no one could escape. And when he thought of Harry, his heart ached most of all. The youngest once had been full of laughter, but now he lived oceans away, carrying wounds that still bled quietly. The family that had once stood shoulder to shoulder now seemed like a collection of distant souls, each trapped behind invisible walls. At dinners, words were careful. At gatherings, eyes met briefly and turned away too soon. The late queen's absence was a silence that none of them could fill. Edward often caught himself wondering what she would think if she could see them now. Her children, her grandchildren, scattered and guarded. Would she blame herself for holding them to such impossible standards of duty? Or would she simply sigh the way she used to and tell them to keep calm and carry on? But Edward couldn't carry on anymore. At night, he lay awake, listening to the slow ticking of the clock in his study. Each sound felt heavier than the one before, like time itself was mocking him. He would stare at the ceiling, replaying old memories, his mother's voice, her smile, the quiet talks they shared when no one else was around. She had once told him, "You have the softest heart of all, Edward. Do not let the crown harden it." He had tried not to, but how long could he keep trying? He felt his wife Sophie's gentle presence beside him, her quiet strength, her kind words, her steady hand on his. She had always understood his silence, even when he did not understand it himself. Him. "Are you all right?" she had asked one evening, her voice soft. "I'm fine," he replied, his usual answer, but the lie sat heavy on his tongue. He wasn't fine, because every time he saw the old photographs, his mother's face, the family's smiles, he felt the ache of what they had lost. Not just her, but the unity, the laughter, the sense of belonging that once tied them together. He had tried to keep her legacy alive by being calm, loyal, and silent. But silence had become his prison. The truth was that Edward carried something deeper, something no one else in the family knew. A secret born long ago, one he had buried beneath years of obedience. It was a truth about the crown, about what it cost them all. And lately, that truth pressed on him harder, refusing to be ignored. In the quiet halls of Windsor, he walked alone that evening, his polished shoes echoing softly against the stone floors. The portraits of his ancestors watched him as he passed, stern faces, heavy crowns, unspoken judgment. He wondered if any of them had ever felt as lonely as he did now. When he reached his private study, he stopped before the large framed photograph that hung above his desk, his mother smiling gently, her eyes as kind as they had always been. For a long moment he just stood there, staring. The world saw her as a monarch. He saw her as a mother who had carried the weight of a kingdom and never complained. Her presence still filled the room. Even in silence she seemed to speak. Edward's throat tightened. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and brushed the edge of the frame. "I cannot keep pretending anymore," he whispered. The words slipped out before he could stop them, breaking the long silence he had kept for years. His voice was quiet but firm, the sound of a man who had spent his life holding everything in, and finally realized he couldn't anymore. In that small moment, the walls seemed to close in around him. His chest ached, not from weakness, but from the weight of a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. The calm prince, the one the world thought never felt, never faltered, stood there, his heart breaking in the dim light of Windsor Castle. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the windows. Inside, the photograph of the late queen caught a flicker of the fading sun, her smile glowing softly, almost as if she were listening. The forgotten hidden heart. Edward had been born into a life already shaped by duty. The youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, he entered a family where every glance, every word, every step was watched. His older siblings, Charles, Anne, and Andrew, filled the palace corridors with noise, confidence, and purpose. Charles carried the weight of destiny, Anne the strength of independence, Andrew the charm of youth, and Edward, he was simply the quiet one. From the start he understood that he was different. The others had voices that filled rooms, opinions that drew attention. Edward learned to listen. When family gatherings grew loud with debate and laughter, he would sit near the edge of the room, smiling softly, letting their words wash over him like music he could not join. No one meant to overlook him, yet somehow he was always the last to be noticed, the last to be asked. He became, as some quietly whispered, the forgotten prince. He remembered the long afternoons in the nursery, watching Charles study his school books with serious focus, while Anne rode her pony with fearless delight. Andrew was the family's golden boy, always adored, always smiling. Edward, shy and thoughtful, would retreat into his world of books and dreams. His tutors said he was bright but reserved. His parents said he was sensitive. The world said very little at all. As he grew older, he found peace in his mother's company. The Queen understood her youngest son in a way few others did, feeding the swans or sketching in a small notebook. Her voice, soft and steady, would reach him through the breeze. "You see the world differently, Edward," she told him once, her eyes kind. "You notice things others do not. That is your gift, but it can also be your burden." He had looked up at her, unsure what she meant. She smiled faintly and added, "You have a heart too soft for the throne." Those words stayed with him forever. Years passed, and Edward watched each of his siblings carve out their paths in the public eye. Charles prepared for kingship, enduring endless scrutiny. Anne worked tirelessly, unshaken, and direct. Andrew enjoyed the spotlight until the glare became too bright, and Edward, he searched for his place, somewhere between duty and peace. When he met Sophie Rhys-Jones, something in him shifted. She was calm, genuine, and unafraid of his quietness. Their love grew slowly but deeply, built not on royal glamour, but on companionship and understanding. For the first time, Edward believed he could have a life that felt truly his own. Their wedding brought him joy, a kind of joy that whispered, "You're seen now." But the royal family's shadow was long and heavy. Even as a married man, Edward found himself constantly measured against his siblings. Every gesture, every decision was compared, questioned, judged. His early attempts at royal projects, a television company, and charity events were met with sharp criticism. When he stumbled, the press was quick to remind the world of it. "He's not like the others," they would write. "He doesn't seem to fit the royal mold." He tried to shrug it off, but the words cut deep. At events, he sometimes caught the whispers from behind the cameras, reporters wondering whether he had any purpose in the monarchy at all. Sophie stood by him through it all. Her calm voice was his anchor. "You do not need to be loud to matter," she would tell him, touching his hand gently. "You matter because you care." He smiled at her words, but deep down he feared she was wrong. The Queen's steady guidance had once kept him centered, but since her passing, the silence around him felt heavier than ever. Without her, the family had grown cold and distant. Charles, now king, carried the burden of a crown that seemed too heavy even for his patience. William's eyes carried the same quiet exhaustion, the look of a man who knew his life was no longer his own. Harry, the brother once full of mischief, now lived oceans away, his laughter replaced by a kind of sorrow that reached even across continents. And Camilla, the queen consort, tried to keep the peace, but Edward could see the strain in her smile. The family that had once stood together for tradition was slowly unraveling under its own history. Edward saw it all, and his heart ached. His mother's words echoed in his mind again, "A heart too soft for the throne." She had been right. His heart could not bear the weight of the crown's silence, nor the endless pretending that all was well when everything felt broken. There was something else too, something he had never spoken of, a truth buried deep within him, bound to the monarchy itself. It was not scandalous, but it was heavy, a memory that haunted his thoughts whenever he stood before a crowd. It reminded him that even the royals, beneath the glitter of gold and the wave of flags, were still human, still fragile. That secret had shaped his life in quiet ways. It was why he had chosen stillness over ambition, humility over recognition. It was why he often stood at the edge of the spotlight, letting others take center stage. He had learned long ago that the monarchy's greatest strength was also its greatest sorrow, the need to hide the very emotions that made them human. Now, as he prepared for another royal event, Edward felt the familiar pull of duty tightening around him. The palace aides arranged his schedule, the photographers waited, and the press gathered eagerly to capture another perfect image of calm royal grace. He wore his suit neatly, his tie precise, his expression composed. Beside him, Sophie's presence steadied him as always. Together they smiled and waved as they stepped out of the car into the bright light of cameras. But as the event went on, something in Edward's eyes began to change. The conversations blurred. The laughter around him felt distant. His thoughts drifted to his mother's words, to the sound of her voice, to the image of his family divided by distance and pride. He felt the secret pressing on his chest again, a reminder that silence was no longer peace. It was a wound he could no longer ignore. A journalist, adjusting her camera, noticed his expression. The calm, collected prince, usually so composed, looked different. His gaze wasn't distant out of boredom, but out of sorrow. One photograph captured it perfectly. Edward standing amid laughter and applause. By the next morning, the image spread quietly across the headlines. "Is something wrong with the Earl of Wessex?" one article asked. Inside the palace, no one mentioned it, but Sophie, sitting beside him at breakfast, reached for his hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to feel it all. The weight, the longing, the quiet grief of being the forgotten prince, with a heart too soft for a throne that demanded silence. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the world was beginning to see the truth in his eyes, the truth of a man who had always been gentle, always loyal, and finally quietly breaking. the gathering storm. The air inside Buckingham Palace felt unusually heavy that afternoon. The long corridors, polished to perfection and scented faintly with old wood and wax, carried an uneasy quiet. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words, thick with expectation and unspoken tension. A private family meeting had been called by King Charles. Only the most senior members of the royal family were invited. The king had described it as a necessary discussion about the monarchy's direction, but everyone knew it meant something more. It was about control, image, and the cracks that had begun to show in the royal walls. The world beyond the palace gates had grown restless. Newspapers whispered about division. Commentators spoke of fading loyalty. The people's love, once steadfast, now wavered under questions and doubts. Inside those gilded rooms, the family gathered to confront what the world was beginning to see, that the crown no longer felt unshakable. When Edward entered the room, his steps were quiet, his face composed as always. Beside him walked Sophie, her hand brushing against his arm in silent comfort. She knew her husband well. She could sense that his calmness today was thin, fragile, stretched over something he hadn't yet spoken. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his expression weary but determined. His health had become the subject of speculation, though he refused to acknowledge it. "We must show unity," he began, his voice firm but tired. "The public must see strength, not division." Across the table, Prince William nodded slightly, though his face carried the weight of unspoken worry. He was practical, dutiful, every inch the heir the country expected. Yet behind his clear blue eyes, there was strain. The pressure of being the future king was showing in small ways, the stiff posture, the tightened jaw. Camilla, seated beside Charles, tried to lighten the mood, her tone gentle, her smile practiced. "Perhaps what we need is a renewed message of family togetherness," she suggested, though even she sounded unsure. No one mentioned Harry by name at first, but his absence lingered in the air like a shadow at the table. The discussion began calmly. Words about public appearances, engagements, and duties flowed easily enough, but soon the tone shifted. William spoke of consistency and discipline, his voice clipped, almost mechanical. "Every misstep reflects on all of us," he said, looking around the table. "We cannot afford emotional displays or confusion. The world expects strength." Edward listened in silence, his hands clasped tightly together. But now, as he looked at his brother and nephew, something inside him began to stir. He could feel Sophie's eyes on him, warm, steady, encouraging without words. Then came a remark, casual, careless, that broke something in him. "It's best we continue as we are," Charles said, his tone low but final. "Some things are beyond repair. Some people," he paused, glancing toward the empty chair that might have belonged to Harry, "have chosen their own path." Edward's breath caught. He had tried to stay silent. For years he had been the family's quiet peacekeeper, the one who never challenged, never fought. But this time he couldn't. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but trembling beneath the surface. "And what if that path isn't entirely their fault?" The room stilled. Charles looked up, confused. "What are you suggesting, Edward?" Edward hesitated, his heart thudding in his chest. "We talk of unity," he said softly, "but we've forgotten what it truly means. We speak of duty and loyalty, but somewhere along the way, we've stopped being human with each other." William frowned. "You think being human means airing private pain in public? That's not strength. It's chaos." Edward turned to him, his gaze steady. "No, I think pretending we're perfect is what's destroying us." Camilla shifted uneasily in her chair. The king's expression hardened. "Edward," he said slowly, "this isn't the time for philosophy. We are here to protect the institution." "Protecting the institution?" Edward repeated quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "At what cost, Charles? The world doesn't see strength when we hide our hearts. They see coldness. They see a family that cannot even look at each other without pretending." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one had ever heard him speak this way, not Charles, not William, not even Sophie. His tone wasn't angry, it was heartbreakingly sincere. "You think you know what the public wants," Edward continued, "but they do not want perfection. They want truth. They want to see a family that feels, not just one that smiles for photographs." The silence that followed was unbearable. Charles's jaw tightened. "What's gotten into you, Edward?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Edward's hands trembled slightly, but his eyes did not waver. "Maybe I've simply had enough of pretending." The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. William looked away, Camilla bit her lip, and Sophie reached for Edward's hand under the table. He squeezed it briefly before standing. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I need some air." He walked out without another word. The palace corridors stretched endlessly before him, the marble floors gleaming under the golden lights. His footsteps echoed, lonely and rhythmic. The meeting replayed in his mind, the disbelief on Charles's face, the tension in William's shoulders, the quiet shock that filled the room. He wasn't angry. He was tired of silence, of pretending that everything was fine, of watching the family he loved fall apart beneath the weight of centuries-old expectations. He passed portraits of his ancestors, kings and queens who had worn the same invisible chains of duty. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him as he walked, solemn and knowing. He wondered how many of them had also felt trapped behind their crowns. When he reached the end of the corridor, he paused by a small side table. Upon it lay a stack of old letters and photographs, keepsakes from the Queen's private collection, which had recently been sorted for preservation. His eyes caught one envelope with familiar handwriting, delicate, elegant, unmistakably hers, his mother's. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone by name, only marked with the royal crest and the date, years ago, just before her passing. With trembling hands, Edward picked it up and unfolded the paper. The faint scent of her perfume still lingered. Her words were written in neat, graceful lines, full of love and quiet wisdom. As he read, his breath grew shallow. She had written about the future, about her hopes for her children, about her fears that the crown might divide them more than it united them. "You must protect the heart of the family," she had written. Not the crown, the heart. Edward stood motionless, the paper shaking slightly between his fingers. Her words pierced through the walls of his chest like light breaking through darkness. He pressed the letter to his heart, his eyes wet but calm. That night, the palace slept quietly. But for Edward, there would be no rest. He walked the corridors until dawn, the letter still in his hand, knowing that the storm he had tried to hold back for years had finally begun to break. And somewhere deep inside Buckingham Palace, the words of the Queen, his mother, still echoed softly, "Protect the heart of the family." The confession. The grand drawing room inside Buckingham Palace had been transformed into a studio of polished lights and quiet whispers. Cameras stood in careful formation, their red signals glowing like watchful eyes. Staff moved softly, straightening the edges of cushions, adjusting the gleam of polished silver, and making sure every royal portrait in the background stood exactly as planned. It was supposed to be a celebration, a documentary marking a royal anniversary, a tribute to endurance, legacy, and grace. Prince Edward sat in the center of it all, still and collected, his calm demeanor reflecting the reputation he had carried for decades. For years, he had been the silent strength of the royal family, loyal, discreet, and untouched by scandal. His quiet presence had earned him respect, even admiration. Yet on this day, the silence that had once protected him felt heavy, almost suffocating. Sophie sat nearby, watching him closely. She had seen that distant look in his eyes before, the same look he wore at his mother's funeral, the same one that returned on nights when sleep refused to come. She reached out, placing a gentle hand over his, giving it a small squeeze. "Are you all right?" she whispered softly. Edward gave a faint smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "I will be," he said, though his voice betrayed the storm building within him. The interviewer, a well-known journalist chosen by the palace for his gentle tone and respectful manner, adjusted his notes. He smiled politely, glancing at the cameras before turning to the prince. "Your Royal Highness," he began, "as the nation reflects on the late Queen's remarkable legacy, may I ask, what do you believe she cherished most about her reign and her family?" It was a simple question, one Edward had likely been asked dozens of times before, but this time, something inside him shifted. His throat tightened, his chest ached with the weight of unspoken truth. For a long moment he said nothing. The crew exchanged quick glances. The cameras kept rolling. Finally, Edward looked up. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "She cherished us," he said, "her family, more than the crown, more than the duty. She used to say that without love, the crown meant nothing." The interviewer smiled, perhaps expecting another well-polished royal reflection. but Edward's eyes grew glassy, and his composure began to crack. "There's something I've never spoken about," he said. "Something my mother once told me, when she knew her time was drawing close." The room fell utterly still. Even the air seemed to pause. "She said," Edward went on, his voice breaking slightly, "Edward, the crown will outlive all of us, but I fear it will divide those who wear it and those who serve it." He swallowed hard. "She told me to protect the heart of the family, not the throne. She made me promise." He drew a shaky breath, glancing down at his clasped hands. "And I have failed her." The words echoed across the silent room. A single tear slipped down his cheek. Sophie's eyes welled up, her fingers tightening around his hand. The interviewer, momentarily speechless, leaned forward. "Your Royal Highness," he began carefully, "are you saying the late Queen feared the family would fracture?" Edward nodded slowly. "She did. She saw what was coming long before any of us did. The tension, the distance, the unspoken hurt. She worried the world would see a royal family polished on the outside but broken within. And she was right." His voice was soft but painfully clear. "I see my brother Charles carrying a burden he can hardly share. I see William trapped between duty and peace. I see Harry far away, trying to build a life beyond all of this. And I wonder, what happened to the warmth that once held us together? What happened to the laughter in these halls?" He paused, his eyes filling again. "I promised her I'd keep it alive. I promised her I'd hold the family together no matter what came, but I couldn't, not even with all my silence, all my patience. I failed." There was a long, aching stillness after that. Even the hum of the equipment seemed to fade. The cameraman lowered his eyes, visibly moved. One of the assistants quietly wiped away a tear. Sophie leaned closer, whispering gently, "Edward, it's all right." But he shook his head. "No, Sophie, it's not. We've spent so long hiding behind duty that we've forgotten how to feel. And now, the world sees only the cracks." The interviewer, clearly touched yet cautious, hesitated. "Do you wish that things had been different?" Edward looked straight at him. "Every day," he whispered. "I wish we'd listened to her more, to her kindness, to her humanity." The Queen was not only a monarch, she was a mother, a woman who carried the weight of a nation and still worried about her children's hearts. He let out a small, trembling laugh. "She once told me I had a heart too soft for royal life. I did not understand it then, but I do now." His eyes lifted to the ceiling, as if speaking to someone far beyond. "I wish I could tell her that her fears were right, that the crown did change us, that it pulled us apart in ways she tried so hard to prevent. But I also wish she knew that her love never left us." Not for a moment tears now flowed freely, and Sophie, unable to contain her emotion, placed her hand on his shoulder. The interviewer glanced at the crew, uncertain whether to stop the recording, but no one moved. The moment felt sacred, too raw to interrupt. Edward exhaled shakily, his voice now just above a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to say any of this. It's not royal to feel so deeply in front of the world. But maybe that's exactly what we need. Maybe the world deserves to see that we're human too." The cameras captured every word, every flicker of emotion. It was not the polished image the palace had intended, but it was something far more powerful. It was true. When the interviewer softly asked, "Do you regret saying it?" Edward only shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I regret keeping silent for so long." And then there was silence, heavy, emotional, unbroken. No one in that room dared to breathe too loudly. The prince sat still, his tears drying slowly under the bright lights. He looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a weight he had carried for years had finally been lifted. Outside, the autumn sun dipped behind the palace walls, casting long shadows across the gardens. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. When the broadcast finally aired, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Across the nation, people watched as a prince, calm, loyal, and long overlooked, broke his silence and revealed the heart of a family long hidden behind protocol. Headlines called it the confession that changed everything. But for Edward, it wasn't about headlines. It was about honesty. It was about keeping a promise to his mother, not the one about protecting the family, but the one about protecting their hearts. And as he stood by the window that evening watching the lights of London flicker below, he whispered softly into the fading sky, "I kept your truth, Mama, and now they finally know." The room was quiet once more, but this time his heart was not. It was heavy with love, filled with loss, yet free, finally free. The Prince speaks from the heart. Morning broke over London with an uneasy light. Newspapers fluttered across pavements, carrying one name above every headline: Prince Edward. People had seen a prince cry, not out of shame but out of love. They had seen humanity where they expected only protocol. But inside Buckingham Palace, warmth turned quickly to frost. In the private study, King Charles sat still, his hands clasped tightly on the polished desk. Before him lay a newspaper, Edward's face frozen mid-tear. The silence in the room was heavy. "He's betrayed the family's trust," Charles said at last, his voice low, sharp. "He's brought emotion into matters that should remain behind closed doors." Camilla watched him quietly. Her expression carried worry rather than anger. "People loved what he said, Charles. They saw his heart." She paused. "I fear sympathy might turn again, and not in your favor." The king's jaw tightened. "Sympathy is dangerous, Camilla. It makes the crown look weak." Elsewhere in Kensington Palace, William stood by his window, his phone in hand. Messages from advisors poured in, warning him to stay neutral, to not comment. Yet his thoughts drifted back to his uncle's trembling voice on television, a voice full of truth. Kate entered the room softly. "You've been reading about it all morning," she said. "I cannot help it," William replied. "He said what so many of us feel but can never say. But how do I stand by him when my father feels betrayed?" Kate touched his arm gently. "Maybe it's not about taking sides," she whispered. "Maybe it's about understanding." Thousands of miles away in California, Harry watched the same clip. His heart ached with recognition. He opened his phone, typing a simple message. "Uncle Edward, you were brave. I know how hard it is to speak when silence feels safer. You did right by her." When Edward read the message later that evening, his eyes softened. "He understands," he murmured to Sophie. She smiled faintly. "Of course he does. You both know what it means to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it." But within the palace walls, the chill deepened. Meetings were held. Statements were drafted. And soon came the quiet instruction Edward would take some time away from duties. The words were polite, but he understood what they meant. Sophie stayed by him, her presence steady and warm. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. He nodded. "Yes, but for once I do not feel like I've done wrong." He looked toward the window, his voice calm. "For the first time in my life, I feel free." I said what she wanted us to remember, that love matters more than the crown. Outside, Britain buzzed with emotion. Crowds left flowers at palace gates. Letters poured in from people thanking him for speaking like a real man, not just a royal. To them, he had become the prince who dared to be honest. Yet within the cold marble halls of the institution, he felt the distance grow. Whispers followed him where he walked. Some looked away. Others spoke with forced politeness. And still, Edward's heart was peaceful. One evening, as twilight fell, he walked through the quiet garden of his home. The air smelled of rain and roses. Sophie joined him, linking her arm through his. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. He smiled, not proudly but softly. "No. I think for the first time, I've done something that would make Mother truly proud." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they stood together in silence, the sky fading into gold and blue. The world might continue to argue, to judge, to dissect every word he'd said. But Edward knew one simple truth. His heart had finally spoken. And though it cost him his peace within the palace, it had given him peace within himself. As the evening breeze brushed past him, he whispered to the quiet air, "I kept your wish, Mother. I told them what truly matters." And with that, the calm prince, once known for silence, became the voice of truth, the royal who reminded the world that behind every crown beats a human heart. The quiet revolution. Months had passed since Prince Edward's tearful confession changed the course of royal life. The noise that once surrounded him had softened into quiet murmurs. The headlines had faded, replaced by new stories, new distractions, but his words, those simple, trembling truths, still lingered in people's hearts. At Bagshot Park, his home tucked away in the gentle countryside, peace had finally returned. The mornings were calm there. The air carried the scent of wet grass, and the trees swayed softly in the breeze. Sophie often found him sitting by the window with a cup of tea, lost in thought, watching the world move at its own unhurried pace. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked one morning as she joined him. He smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. The noise? No, he said quietly. But sometimes I miss the illusion that everything was fine. Bagshot Park had become their refuge, a place far from the whispers of court and the echo of duty. Here, Edward walked the gardens freely, without photographers waiting behind the gates. He spoke with neighbors, visited local schools, and listened to people whose struggles reminded him that his mother had been right. The heart mattered more than the crown ever could. Though he had stepped away from many royal duties, his purpose had found new shape. He poured his time into charitable work, particularly causes centered around mental well-being and family reconciliation. He met families torn apart by distance and silence, people who hadn't spoken to their loved ones in years. He listened to their stories, his gentle manner putting them at ease. "It's never too late to speak," he would tell them softly. "Even if the words come with tears, it's better than a lifetime of silence." Letters arrived by the thousands, handwritten notes from strangers, mothers, veterans, widows, and young people who had seen his confession and felt something shift inside them. Some thanked him for his honesty. Others shared their own secrets, their own regrets, as if his words had given them permission to feel again. Sophie often read a few aloud in the evenings, her voice tender. This one says, "Thank you for reminding us that even those born into palaces have hearts that can break." Edward would listen quietly, his eyes soft. "It's strange," he said once. "I spent my life thinking silence protected the family, but now I see that silence only builds walls. Truth brings healing. And healing was what he sought, not just for the monarchy but for himself." One quiet afternoon, when the air was crisp and golden, he returned to Windsor. The castle stood silent under the autumn sun, its stones glowing faintly. Edward walked alone through the corridors that once echoed with laughter and ceremony, until he reached St. George's Chapel, the resting place of his beloved mother. Inside, it was still and sacred. The light from the stained glass windows fell in soft colors over the stone floor. He approached slowly, stopping before her resting place. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, in a whisper that trembled with love, he said, "I did it, Mama. I spoke. I protected what you asked me to, the heart of the family. I couldn't save everything, but I spoke the truth." His eyes glistened, but his voice stayed steady. "You always told me that love was our true legacy." I understand that now. He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the chapel wrap around him like a blessing. The weight that had once lived on his shoulders had eased. He wasn't the forgotten prince anymore. He was the one who had found courage and honesty. As he stepped out of the chapel, the sunlight poured over him, warm and golden. He paused, taking a slow breath. The garden shimmered in the distance, and for the first time in years, he smiled with peace that came from within. The world might remember him as the quiet royal who spoke when no one else dared. But to Edward, he was simply a son who had kept a promise, not to the throne, not to history, but to the woman who had taught him the meaning of love and truth. He walked through the gates of Windsor that day with calm steps, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The crown might belong to his brother, but the people's hearts, they now beat in rhythm with his honesty. And as the sunlight followed him down the path, one truth remained clear. Edward was no longer the silent prince. He was the one who reminded a nation that even royals bleed, love, and hurt, just like everyone else.